Hey folks, what's up? It's Jamie from Books and Ladders, and today I have a review of Fathomfolk by Eliza Chan for you. I received a copy of this book from Orbit Books, and it in no way is influencing my review, and I can tell you that with confidence because I only rated this book 2 stars. So let's jump right into it. Fathomfolk is said to be a good fit for those seeking a story that explores themes of self-love, found family, and political intrigue, as it's set in a fantastical underwater world with a focus on the struggles of marginalized communities and the power of resistance and change. It is compared to Jade City and the Bone Shard Daughter. Fathomfolk by Eliza Chan is one of Orbit's new voices for 2024, so thanks again to Orbit for sending me a copy of this book. Fathomfolk has a lot of content warnings, which I will list in the description below, and do my best not to talk about in the review today. I'm also going to link to my and Zaina's reviews on Goodreads, as they talk about some of the harmful aspects of Pan-Asian mythology that are depicted in this book that me, as not being Asian, do not have the same insight and knowledge to discuss. I will say that because of the comparisons to Jade City and the Bone Shard Daughter, both books which I absolutely adored, I thought I would like this one a lot more than I did, but there was just something holding back from me really enjoying this novel. First and foremost, like I mentioned, the mixture of all the Asian cultures didn't quite hit the mark for me. It felt like instead of sticking to one mythology and one story that we could really pinpoint, it was all over the place and didn't quite have that flow and enmeshment that I would have really liked. As for the rest of this, I really wanted the book to have a little bit more substance. I felt like at times we were just meandering through the plot rather than being really intentional or thoughtful about what scenes were included and how we went from point A to point B. And I think part of that is because of the choice in perspectives through this novel. There are 3 different point of views that we have, one being Nami, one being Mira, and one being Serena/Cordelia. These 3 point of views made it really difficult to follow and understand who knew what, because there was some overlap in the characters and when they would discuss and talk to one another, but it also was a little bit confusing about who knew what and why they knew what they knew, especially since when they did overlap and discuss with one another, they didn't really share those separate plot points, separate knowledge, separate understanding with one another, but then knew about it in their next perspective chapters, and it made it really confusing how they would know some of that information without us seeing that they were being told it. As well, sometimes it felt like we were being told the wrong information from the wrong perspective. We would be in, for example, Mira's perspective and learn something about Cordelia that probably should have come from Cordelia's perspective, so we had a bit more insight into her mindset, why she was doing what she was doing, and what intentions she even had when she was doing these different elements. So it felt really out of place sometimes for when we even gained this knowledge and then how it was shared back with the other perspectives that we got, especially when you saw some of the interactions between Nami and Mira, since their common point was Nami's brother and Mira's love interest, Kai. I'll be honest and say that I didn't really like any of the perspectives, but Mira's was the most grounded for me. She really had a good sense of who she was, and we saw her growth throughout the novel, although some of her choices really didn't make sense in the context of who she was and what she was trying to accomplish, but we'll get to that in a minute. So let's talk about the main characters in this novel. First, we have Mira, who's a half-siren, and she's the first Fathomfolk in the military and the first to become a captain. We also have Kai, who's a dragon, and we don't really see his perspective, but he's shown in both Mira's and Nami's perspective because Mira is dating him and Nami is his sister, and he is the ambassador for Fathomfolk who's trying to work towards a better future for the Fathomfolk people. Nami is also a dragon, and as I mentioned, she's Kai's opinionated and stubborn younger sister who becomes exiled at the beginning of the novel to this city that they live in, and she is determined for some of that drastic change and falls in with the anti-human rebellious extremist group. We also have Cordelia, who's a sea witch, and she's ambitious and selfish, but she's also the wife of one of the most powerful counselors and manipulates from behind the scenes, both for the Fathomfolk and for the humans, and really is just trying to better her own position. And now, if you aren't already confused and feeling like I'm pointing to a conspiracy map, There's also a twist that one of the perspectives is labeled as Serena, but is actually Cordelia. It switches within like 4 or 5 chapters into the book, so it's not really the twist that I think the author was going for. And it ends up being such a silly plot point because it's supposed to be, in my mind, showing how the humans are acting and how the Fathomfolk are acting, but really it's just all Fathomfolk in these perspectives that we see. So instead of showing that duality of how people are treated as Fathomfolks and how the humans see them, we don't really get that with any of the perspectives. It's very clear that we're only seeing the Fathomfolk perspective and that we're not getting that human perspective. So it's not really showcasing what those differences are or why the humans see the Fathomfolk as lesser or why they might even want to have that element of segregation, or why Nami becomes part of this anti-human extremist group and what their end goal is, because we don't really see the intention of the humans in this novel. But part of that problem is that because we didn't get a human perspective, we didn't really get that interesting and enlightening way to the world and politics. But also, Serena and Cordelia, however you want to call them, was not a great character. So her flaws heavily outweighed any aspect of her good elements or any of the insight we got into the counselors and politics of this. Because her whole storyline was trying to break that sea witch trope, so not being seen as sketchy or selfish. But instead she fell right into it and really tried to manipulate things on both ends of the spectrum. And because everybody and every perspective was on the outside of the council, so Mira and Nami had Kai in the council, but they themselves weren't in the council, and Cordelia was married to a counselor, but not in the council herself, we didn't actually get to see the way that politics works. We got to see how people thought they were being affected by politics, but not trying to actually make the change. There were some vague hints to what Cordelia wanted to do and what Kai wanted to do in order to make changes, but we didn't actually get to see what that behind the scenes looked like because we were kept out of the room for where that actually happened. There was some insights into it near the end of the novel, but because it was so late, it really felt like the politics wasn't the highlight that it was supposed to be, considering the whole back copy of this novel talks about how, we're having this extremism, we're having this political intrigue, we're trying to make changes, but we never really saw that from the perspective of what it means to be in power in this world, in this city. On top of that, the politics was just full of tropes. There was ambassadors trying to solve the problems from within, which as I mentioned, we didn't really see. Young political extremism that was seen as, or at least depicted as, something that was really bad and not a viable solution, especially around protesting and the activism that they try to do. And just generally speaking, how people take advantage of the system for their own selfish gain. But there was no nuance to any of this. It felt as though the author thought if she wasn't putting it into every scene, dialogue, and thought from every perspective, that the reader wouldn't understand at all. Which meant that it really cheapened any of the scenes that looked at things like the xenophobic adjacent issues and behaviors and how that society really comes together or falls apart when people are forced to integrate, work together, and confront their long-held prejudices. Part of the issue that I had was how these different elements of political activism were shown to be quote-unquote bad. So instead of demonstrating that protests, activism, really trying to stick it to the man was a way that you really can make change, the anti-human activist group was just all over the place. It was almost as if we were showing that young people can't understand things from the political point of view of people in charge, and that because of that, they shouldn't have any opinion at all. And I don't think that's really what the author was going for, but that's the point that was driven through Nami's perspective, especially when she figured out what the power was, how politics plays into it, and really just going against both Mira and Kai's perspective, opinion, thoughts to make the changes that she tried to do. I also felt like a lot of the relationships were quite juvenile and very insta-love-like, especially when we look at Nami's relationships, because everything felt fairly predictable, especially when we were in Nami's perspective in general. I really thought that there could have been more nuance to her relationships with both Mira and Kai, but also within that anti-human extremist group, which I forget the name of and I don't care to look it up because I really just didn't enjoy this book at all. Because of where we're dropped into the novel, we're not really given the chance to explore Mira and Kai's relationship because they are already together, already in love, already even living together. And so because of that, we don't get to see how they came from such different backgrounds to fall in love, especially with the prejudice around Mira being half siren and sirens being seen as always manipulating, always controlling people to actually like them even when they don't. So how did her and Kai get past that point? How did they get to trust one another and where they are and how they were able to do that? Especially when we see in Mira's perspectives, a lot of times she feels really out of place in Kai's world, which is obviously more lavish, more rich. And so at some points it feels like she's falling out of love with Kai, only for them to get back to where they are or where we assume they're supposed to be with little to no fanfare. I really felt like everyone's relationships were forced and really out of place when it comes to the romances. However, the familial relationships in this were really great. I think that was probably the shining moment for this, was how people worked together, how they understood family, especially found family for some of the different elements that we saw in the military. But I really loved watching Mira and her mom together and the sacrifices that they both made for one another. I really liked that strong mother-daughter bond and making sure that they were both happy and secure in who they were and how they were moving forward. I also thought that Kai and Nami had a really good sibling relationship that was depicted really well on page, where, you know, they're both jealous of the lives that the other gets to have, because Kai always has to be that prodigal son, where Nami gets to be a little bit more rebellious, and both of them want to be in their other's shoes at some point or another. The pacing of this book was really slow and boring at some points, which isn't typically a bad thing in these types of fantasy novels that are trying to build out these really big worlds, these really big ideas, but because there was so much time in between action scenes and it felt like nothing was really developing between them, where we got this big explosive scene, then nothing, then another big explosive scene, and it felt like neither of them were really connected to one another, or there was no reason that one happened and then the other, that it really just didn't hit the mark a lot of times. Then as we started getting about 60% of the way through the book, I felt like we could have ended at about 6 different times. There was like 6 different plot points that could have ended the book, but it kept going. And I had to put it down at some points because I just felt like it was a slog. I really felt like I was going to DNF, or did not finish it, around that 70% mark, because I just didn't understand why each chapter and scene felt like the ending of a book that still had 100 or so pages to it. And there was a scene near the end that felt like it was an epilogue to the actual story itself, rather than the next logical sequence in the book. But there was an epilogue on top of it, even though this is a series. And it felt like that was kind of added in after the fact because it wanted to connect to whatever the next book is supposed to do, but it just felt really out of place. So this ending to this novel felt like it was all too much and not really well thought out, and it could have been a really solid ending. As much as there were some pacing issues and some issues that I had with the politics overall, I felt like it could have at least been a good setup to a series, instead of just feeling like a nothing towards that ending. And like I mentioned, this is the first in a series called The Drowned World, and because of that, I'm a little bit concerned about where this is going to go next, especially with how it actually ended. Not even the epilogue, but the piece before that. It was kind of stupid, I'm not gonna lie. I don't know how else to explain it, I just really didn't enjoy it. I felt like it didn't really add to anything in the novel itself, and was just a way to end this part of the story before moving on to the next one. I feel like the more I talk about this book, the less I like it. I was really happy to receive it early and have the chance to review it. The cover is really gorgeous, and in theory it should have checked off all my boxes, especially when compared to The Bone Shard Daughter by Andrea Stewart and Jade City, both books that I really enjoyed. But in my mind, it doesn't really compare to them because of the mismatched politics that are in this, the perspectives that didn't really work, and some of that overlap that I just really didn't enjoy at all. If everything I said sounded like the perfect book for you, you can pick this one up on February 27th. It would be really great if you use my affiliate link for bookshop.org down below. That helps me make more videos like this to provide insight into books that you may or may not want to read. Thank you again to Orbit Books for sending me a copy, and until next time, bye!